There is a specific kind of arrogance that only exists in the suburban sprawl of the modern West. A delusional sense of sovereignty that leads a person to believe that because they pay 4 figures a month in association dues, they have somehow achieved dominion over the laws of nature and the sanctity of a man's home. And that is exactly the kind of hubris that led Eleanor Vance, the self-appointed queen of the Evergreen Heights HOA, to climb over a reinforced cedar fence in the dead of night. Clutching a canister of industrial-strength pepper spray and a sense of righteousness that was about to collide with 700 pounds of unyielding Arctic muscle. Her target was Frost, a massive, chocolate-coated alpha reindeer with antlers that spanned the width of a sedan and eyes that held the cold, ancient wisdom of the tundra, a creature she had decided was a public nuisance and a threat to property values in her manicured kingdom of beige stucco and hollow promises. In her mind, she was a crusader liberating the neighborhood from a dangerous beast, but on my high-definition trail cameras, she looked like a frantic, middle-aged trespasser who had fundamentally misunderstood the difference between a golden retriever and a territorial bull. And as I watched the footage later, I couldn't help but wonder, what kind of madness drives a woman to believe she can bully a force of nature? My name is Elias Thorne, and I'm a man who spent 20 years in the United States Army Rangers, breathing in the dust of distant valleys and the metallic scent of adrenaline until my soul was as frayed as a combat flag, eventually returning to the only thing I had left, a sprawling, 20-acre sanctuary I call the Northern Reach. I moved here to bury the ghosts of the wars I fought and the memory of my wife, Clara, whose battle with cancer was the only fight I ever truly lost, leaving me with a teenage daughter named Maya and a silence in our home that was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. We didn't set out to be reindeer people, but it started with Echo, a sickly, discarded calf we took in as a therapy project for my own PTSD, and before we knew it, the herd had grown to 12, becoming the quiet, breathing heartbeat of our healing process, a living bridge between the world I had lost and the peace I was trying to build for my daughter. And then there was Frost, the guardian bull, a majestic, silver-maned alpha who didn't follow commands because he was subservient, but because he respected the boundary we shared, acting as the silent sentinel of the paddock who understood that his job wasn't just to lead the herd, but to protect the 2 broken humans who fed them. But the world outside our fence, specifically the Evergreen Heights HOA, saw our peace as an insult to their order, led by Eleanor Vance in her silver Lexus, who began patrolling our perimeter with the cold, calculating eyes of a vulture, documenting the smell of manure that didn't exist and the acoustic disturbance of animals that are famously silent. She started with the nasty grams, official-looking letters on heavy bond paper, citing everything from aesthetic disharmony to zoning violations, trying to manipulate me with a faux moral language of community standards, not realizing that a man who has survived a roadside IED in Kandahar isn't particularly intimidated by a woman complaining about the color of his barn doors. The harassment shifted from bureaucratic to personal when the HOA board, led by Eleanor and her vice president, a spineless man named Arthur, began a campaign of psychological warfare that felt less like neighborhood management and more like a low-budget spy thriller, involving binoculars, fixed-schedule drive-bys, and the deliberate spreading of rumors in the community newsletter that our vicious wild animals were a danger to the local children. They even hired a fake zoning inspector, a man who looked more like a disgraced private investigator than a city official, who attempted to enter our paddock under the guise of an audit, only to be met by me, my military-grade discharge papers, and a very clear warning that the next time he crossed that line, without a warrant, he'd be dealing with the county sheriff and my lawyer, who was already salivating at the prospect of a harassment suit. But Eleanor was relentless, her obsession with cleansing our property becoming a frantic, feverish need, leading her to stand at the very edge of our fence line every evening, filming the reindeer with her phone and screaming at Maya whenever I wasn't around, telling her that her pets would be hauled off to a slaughterhouse the moment the HOA won their inevitable legal battle. It was a war of nerves, a constant, low-level vibration of hostility that began to frame Maya's fragile sense of security, and I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a concerned neighbor. I was dealing with a bully who had mistaken my desire for peace for a lack of resolve. So, I began building my own evidence escalation file, a meticulous record of every trespass, every threatening letter, and every midnight drive-by, reinforced by a network of floodlights and trail cameras that turned our perimeter into a high-definition surveillance zone, waiting for the moment when Eleanor's ego would finally outpace her common sense. And that moment arrived on a Tuesday night in November, under a cold, crescent moon, when Eleanor and a hooded accomplice decided to liberate the paddock by cutting the lock on the secondary gate and entering the herd's sleeping area with orange flags and plastic batons, intending to spook the animals into a stampede that would prove their danger to the public. It was a scene straight out of a cinematic disaster, with Eleanor screaming and waving her flags, causing the younger Reindeer to bolt in a blind panic. And poor Echo, the calf that started it all, suffering a minor gash on her leg as she slammed into the fence. But then the chaos stopped, because Frost had stepped out of the shadows, his massive head lowered, his breath huffing in the cold air like a steam engine, a 700-pound wall of muscle and bone that stood between the trespassers and his family. Eleanor, blinded by her own adrenaline, actually poked Frost in the chest with her plastic baton, an act of sheer, unadulterated stupidity that finally broke the bull's legendary patience, leading to a controlled, earth-shaking charge that didn't kill her, but sent her flying backward into a pile of reindeer droppings with her dignity, and her silver Lexus key fob shattered in the mud. The aftermath was a masterpiece of karmic retribution, beginning with the arrival of the state police, who didn't find a vicious beast but rather a calm, protective herd and a mountain of digital evidence that proved Eleanor had committed criminal trespass, animal endangerment, and attempted livestock theft, all while she sat in the back of a patrol car, trying to explain that she was just trying to help. The HOA board immediately tried to distance themselves, sending out a frantic email claiming the incident was a misunderstanding by a rogue member, but my lawyer, a man who treats litigation like a blood sport, hit them with a civil suit so massive it threatened to dissolve the entire association's insurance policy. But the final nail in Eleanor's coffin came from a whistleblower named Denise, a former board member who had grown disgusted with the corruption and handed us a treasure trove of internal chats and emails, revealing a premeditated conspiracy to trigger the veterans' PTSD so they could have me declared mentally unfit to own the property. In the courtroom, as Maya stood on the witness stand and spoke about how Echo and Frost had helped her heal from the loss of her mother, and as the footage of Eleanor's midnight raid was projected onto a 20-foot screen, the silence in the room was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. The judge didn't just rule in our favor. He dismantled Eleanor's life, awarding us $118,000 in damages, issuing a permanent no-contact order, and recommending criminal charges that eventually forced her to sell her home and flee Willow Creek in a cloud of shame. The Evergreen Heights HOA board was forced to resign en masse, replaced by people who actually understood that a neighborhood is a community, not a cult, and the bylaws were rewritten to ensure that no board would ever again have the power to harass a resident based on the aesthetics of their soul. We used the settlement money to turn the Northern Reach into a registered nonprofit called Herd and Heal, a sanctuary where other veterans and grieving children can come to find the same quiet, antlered peace that saved our lives, turning Eleanor's malice into a foundation for hope. Today, as I stand at the fence line with Frost, his antlers velvet and his spirit calm, I look over at the beige houses in the distance, and I realize that peace isn't something that is given to you by a committee. It is something you guard with everything you have. Eleanor Vance tried to draw a line in the sand, but she forgot that some lines aren't written on paper. They breathe, they stand, and sometimes, if you push them too far, they lower their antlers. The closure. The Vance era of Willow Creek is a ghost story now, a warning whispered to new residents about the danger of letting a title go to your head, while the Northern Reach stands as a testament to the fact that truth and nature are far more resilient than the petty whims of an HOA bully. Justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with the weight of an alpha bull. This story brings us to the heart of the modern American struggle between the new world of committees and the old world of individual legacy and natural healing. Did the HOA have any legitimate right to concern themselves with the presence of large livestock in a residential adjacent area? Or was their entire premise a violation of the live and let live American spirit? How do we, as a society, address the disgusting tactic of using a person's military service and PTSD as a weapon in a civil dispute? Should this be categorized as a hate crime or a specific form of aggravated harassment? When a human willfully enters the territory of a large animal with the intent to harass it, is the owner responsible for the animal's reaction, or should the law recognize the Frost rule, that nature owes no apology to a trespasser? What would you do? Would you have stayed as calm as Elias, or would you have fought fire with fire the moment they stepped on your dirt? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that a man's home is his castle, antlers and all, hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep telling these stories of cinematic justice.